So under an order imposed by the court in this criminal case, Donald Trump is not allowed to make or direct others to make public statements about known or reasonably foreseeable witnesses concerning their potential participation in the investigation or in this criminal proceeding. He's not allowed to do that. The prosecution is now arguing that Trump has done that a lot. There'll be a hearing tomorrow morning at 9:30 Eastern before the jurors come into the courtroom. Prosecutors are going to ask the judge to find that former President Trump willfully violated the gag order by attacking well-known potential witnesses, including Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, attacking their credibility on up to 10 separate occasions. If the judge finds Trump in criminal contempt of court on these matters, Trump could be fined up to $1,000 each for each violation. That's what the prosecutors are asking for. He could possibly be sentenced to a maximum of 30 days in jail, although prosecutors are certainly not asking for that yet. I mean, tonight Trump sent around a fundraising email called My Farewell Message, making it sound like he's definitely going to jail. I already meant to ask our legal experts about it, but we just queued up some new sound from Donald Trump today. This is from an interview on a conservative network called Real America's Voice. Here it is, Donald Trump talking about the jury in his trial.
That jury was picked so fast, 95% Democrats. The area is mostly all Democrat. You think of it as just a purely Democrat area. It's a very unfair situation, that I can tell you.
That jury, 95% Democrats. Again, the last item in the gag order forbids Trump from making or directing others to make public statements about any prospective juror or any juror in this criminal proceeding. Andrew Weissmann, still with us here tonight. The gag order has been the discussion that I feel like we've had around the edges of this case a lot, because it's the way that Trump has tried to kind of shape the environment around this case. It's going to be in the courtroom front and center tomorrow morning at 9:30. What do you expect Judge Merchan is going to do? What are you going to be watching for?
So you have Donald Trump clearly goading the judge. The fact that he's doing something that appears by all accounts to be a direct violation of the order as late as tonight, in advance of a 9:30 hearing on violations with respect to witnesses and a violation with respect to jurors, both of which are things that a judge is going to care tremendously about. I think obviously he's going to hear from the defense, and, the betting is that he's going to certainly say that there was a violation, and he could impose the fine that is obviously negligible, and he can saber rattle about what's next. This is one where what I would say, if he were sitting right here, I would say leave aside politics, leave aside what he's goading somebody to do. What would you do for any other defendant? We have seen the legal system bend over sort of so far to accommodate Donald Trump. He is not being treated worse. He is being treated so much better, whether you're talking about DOJ, whether you're talking about all of the criminal cases. And this is one where he wouldn't have to impose 30 days in jail, but he can really do like a child, give him a timeout. He can be stepped back and be kept in the pens in the courthouse. But I think this is so clearly like a child testing what will happen. And it's at the very outset of the case. If there isn't a firm hand right now and the rule of law isn't imposed, it really is a terrible message in terms of how the trial's going to go forward, because he's going to continue doing this. And if there are jurors he doesn't like, he can attack them. If he's going to try and seek a mistrial by his antics, that's something he could try. So the court, who is extremely experienced, I think is going to have to be really careful about what exact is the sanction he's going to impose tomorrow. How
will the judge decide, or how will the hearing on this go? Again, this is going to be the way that court starts tomorrow. Is he going to ask defense? Is he just going to rule, or is he going to ask defense counsel and the prosecutors to make arguments in front of him? Is he going to, have a witness talk?
So he could ask both sides to state their position. He could see if there is a dispute of facts. You could actually have a hearing on this. But there may not be a dispute of facts. I mean, the facts seem so clear unless Donald Trump's going to say somebody else took over my account. You know, Roger Stone tried that when he was in violation. He actually took the witness stand and said, I didn't do that. And then he later sort of recanted and said, OK, I did do it. And, you know, that was when he posted the judge's picture with crosshairs next to her head. And so there can be a hearing, but it may not be necessary, just given the volume of allegations here. There's now, I think, up to 11 allegations that are going to be before the judge. But ultimately, it would be the state's burden to go forward.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.